The morning of Lady Arabella Thornwood's wedding dawned cold and grey over the Devonshire countryside, a fitting reflection of the dread that had settled in her heart. She stood before the mirror in her childhood bedchamber while her ladies made fasten the last pearl button on her wedding gown, watching her own pale reflection as though observing a stranger being dressed for sacrifice. The gown was exquisite, ivory silk overlaid with Brussels lace that had belonged to her grandmother, the bodice fitted precisely to her slender frame, the skirts falling in elegant folds that would trail behind her down the aisle. Yet Arabella felt nothing but numbness as she studied herself. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure, threaded with orange blossoms and seed pearls. Her hazel eyes, usually bright with intelligence and humor, appeared dull and resigned. "You look beautiful, my lady," her maid whispered, tears glistening in her own eyes. Sarah had been with Arabella since childhood and knew the truth of this match, that it was not born of affection but of necessity, of debts unpaid and reputations to salvage. Arabella managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Sarah. That will be all." When the door closed behind her maid, Arabella sank onto the cushioned bench before her vanity, her hands trembling in her lap. In mere hours she would become the Duchess of Ashford, wife to a man she had met only twice before their betrothal. Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ashford, was reportedly one of the wealthiest men in England, having made his fortune through strategic investments and shrewd business acumen that most of the aristocracy found distastefully common. He was also, according to rumors whispered behind fans at every ball and soirée, as cold as winter frost and twice as cutting. She had first seen him 6 weeks ago at Lady Pembroke's ball. He had stood apart from the other guests, tall and imposing in his black evening clothes, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the severity of his expression. His eyes, a peculiar shade of grey that reminded her of storm clouds, had surveyed the crowd with barely concealed contempt. When their gazes had met across the ballroom, Arabella had felt a chill run down her spine. The next day he had called upon her father. Lord Edmund Thornwood had emerged from that meeting with an expression of relief so profound that Arabella had known immediately that her fate had been sealed. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with him, and the Duke of Ashford had offered a solution: marriage to his only daughter in exchange for the settlement of all outstanding obligations and a generous allowance that would restore the Thornwood family to financial security. "You will accept him, of course," her father had said, not asked. "He is a duke, Arabella. You could not hope for a better match." Arabella had wanted to scream that she had hoped for love, for partnership, for the kind of marriage her parents had once shared before her father's weakness for cards had poisoned everything. But she had seen the desperation in her father's eyes, the fear lurking beneath his bravado, and she had known that refusal was not an option. The alternative was ruin for her entire family. Her mother, her 2 younger sisters still in the schoolroom. They would lose everything: their home, their position in society, their futures. So she had nodded and accepted her role as the sacrificial lamb. Their second meeting had been the formal occasion when the Duke had presented her with an engagement ring, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that felt like a shackle around her finger. They had sat in her family's drawing-room, chaperoned by her mother, and made stilted conversation about the weather and the upcoming season. The Duke had been polite but distant, his manner suggesting he was fulfilling an obligation rather than courting a future bride. He had not smiled once during the entire visit. Now, as Arabella sat in her wedding finery, she wondered what her life would be like as the wife of such a man. Would he be cruel? Indifferent? Would he keep mistresses, as so many men of his class did? Would their marriage be nothing but a cold business arrangement, devoid of warmth or companionship? A knock at the door interrupted her dark thoughts. Her father entered, resplendent in his morning coat, his expression a mixture of pride and guilt. "It's time, my dear," he said softly. "The carriages are ready." Arabella rose, smoothing her skirts with hands that had steadied now that the moment had finally arrived. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She was a Thornwood, descended from a line that had stood firm through wars and plagues and political upheavals. She would face this trial with dignity, whatever it might bring. The church was filled to capacity when Arabella arrived, the pews packed with members of the ton eager to witness the wedding of the season. She recognized faces from countless balls and dinners, women who had once been friendly but now regarded her with a mixture of envy and pity. Everyone knew the circumstances of this match, though no one would speak of it openly. That was the way of their world, everything hidden beneath layers of propriety and pretense. The organ began to play, and Arabella took her father's arm. Together, they began the long walk down the aisle. The Duke of Ashford stood at the altar, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him. He did not turn to watch her approach, as most bridegrooms did. Instead, he stared straight ahead at the altar, his profile cold and classical as a Roman statue. Arabella felt her heart sink further. This was truly to be a marriage of convenience in every sense of the word. When they reached the altar, her father placed her hand in the Duke's. His grip was firm and cool, his expression still unreadable as the ceremony began. The vicar's words washed over Arabella in a blur. She heard herself making the required responses as though from a great distance, her voice steady even as her heart pounded in her chest. And then came the moment when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, instructing the Duke to kiss his bride. Adrian Blackwell turned to her then, and for the first time Arabella saw something flicker in those grey eyes, something dark and intense that made her breath catch. He lowered his head, and she tilted her face up as propriety demanded. His lips met hers in a kiss that began chaste and ceremonial but lingered just a moment too long, applying a pressure that seemed to carry a message she could not quite decipher. When he pulled back, he leaned close, his lips nearly brushing her ear. To any observer, it would appear as though he was whispering an endearment to his new bride. But the words he spoke sent ice through Arabella's veins. "I hate your family and your own father with all of my heart." The words were delivered in a voice so low and controlled that only she could hear, yet they carried the force of a physical blow. Arabella's eyes widened, and she felt the color drain from her face. Before she could respond, before she could even process what he had said, the Duke straightened, offering his arm with perfect propriety as the organ swelled with triumphant music. Arabella took his arm mechanically, her mind reeling. She managed to maintain her composure as they processed back down the aisle, smiling and nodding to the assembled guests even as questions and fears tumbled through her thoughts like autumn leaves in a storm. What had he meant? Why did he hate her family? And if this was true, why had he married her? The wedding breakfast that followed was an elaborate affair held at Thornwood Hall, the family's country estate. Long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies prepared by London's finest caterers. Her father had spared no expense for this wedding, even though it was the Duke's money that had paid for everything. Arabella sat at the head table beside her new husband, accepting congratulations from a stream of well-wishers while trying desperately to understand the man beside her. The Duke played his part flawlessly. He was attentive without being warm, polite without being friendly. He filled her wine-glass and ensured she had the choicest portions of food. To anyone watching, he was the picture of a proper bridegroom. But Arabella could feel the tension in him, the carefully controlled anger that radiated from his frame like heat from a banked fire. When her father rose to give a toast, praising the Duke's generosity and welcoming him to the family, Arabella felt the Duke's hand tighten on his wine-glass with such force that she feared it would shatter. She glanced at him and saw his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Whatever hatred he harbored for her father, it was no idle dislike. It was something deep and consuming. The afternoon wore on with endless speeches and toasts. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the Duke rose and announced that it was time for them to depart for Ashford Park, his estate in Hampshire. There was a flurry of farewells, her mother crying softly, her sisters clinging to her, her father looking relieved that the day had gone so smoothly. Arabella climbed into the Duke's elegant traveling coach, settling onto the plush velvet seats as her new husband followed her inside. The door closed, the coachman cracked his whip, and they were moving, leaving behind everything she had ever known. For several miles, Neither of them spoke. Arabella stared out the window at the passing countryside, her mind still struggling to make sense of the Duke's whispered confession. Finally, she could bear the silence no longer. "Your Grace," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I believe you owe me an explanation." He turned from his own contemplation of the landscape, one dark eyebrow rising. "An explanation of what, madam?" "Of what you said to me at the altar. You claimed to hate my family, to hate my father with all your heart. Yet you married me. Why?" For a long moment he simply studied her, his gray eyes assessing. Then he leaned back in his seat, his expression hardening into something that might have been satisfaction. "You want the truth? Very well. 20 years ago, your father destroyed mine." Arabella felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "Your father and mine were friends once, in their youth. They went to Oxford together, moved in the same circles. My father, the late Duke, trusted Lord Thornwood implicitly. So when your father came to him with a business proposition, an investment opportunity that promised substantial returns, my father invested heavily without proper investigation." The Duke's voice grew colder with each word. "It was a fraud. A scheme designed by your father and his associates to defraud wealthy investors. My father lost nearly half his fortune. When he confronted Lord Thornwood, your father denied everything, claimed he had been deceived as well. But I found the evidence years later, after my father's death, correspondence that proved your father had known exactly what he was doing." Arabella felt as though the floor of the coach was tilting beneath her. "That's impossible. My father would never—" "Your father is a liar and a cheat," the Duke interrupted, his voice cutting. "The loss devastated my father. It destroyed his faith in friendship, in honor. He became bitter, withdrawn. He died when I was 17, and I believe to this day that your father's betrayal broke something in him that never healed." "And so you married me for revenge," Arabella whispered, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "You paid my father's debts not out of generosity, but because you wanted to own what was his, to take from him what he valued most." The Duke's smile was cold. "Now you begin to understand. For 20 years, I have waited for the opportunity to repay your father for what he did to mine. When I learned of his financial difficulties, I knew my moment had come. He values his position in society above all else. What better way to torment him than to marry his precious daughter and bind him to me forever? Every time he sees us together, he will remember what he owes me. Every time he thinks of you, he will be reminded that his own actions put you in my power." Arabella felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "And what of me, your Grace? Am I to be nothing more than a pawn in your game of vengeance? Did you give no thought to what your actions would mean for me?" Something flickered in his eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? But it was gone before she could be certain. "You are a duke's daughter. You were raised to marry for advantage, not for love. This match has made you a duchess, one of the highest-ranking women in the realm. Surely that compensates for any lack of affection." "I would rather be a pauper with a husband who respected me than a duchess married to a man consumed by hatred for my family," Arabella shot back, her voice shaking with emotion she could no longer contain. "You have bound us together in matrimony, your Grace, but you have also ensured that there can never be anything between us but resentment and regret." She turned away from him then, facing the window once more, her hands clenched in her lap. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She would not show weakness before a man who had already demonstrated he had no regard for her feelings. The rest of the journey passed in tense silence. Darkness fell, and still they traveled, the coach lamps casting dancing shadows across the interior. Arabella's mind churned with everything she had learned. Could it be true? Could her father truly have committed such a betrayal? She had always known he was weak, that his gambling had brought them to the brink of ruin. But deliberate fraud? Could he truly be capable of such villainy? And yet, something in the Duke's manner convinced her he was not lying. The pain beneath his anger was too raw, too real to be fabricated. Whatever had happened between their fathers, Adrian Blackwell believed every word he had spoken. It was well past midnight when the coach finally rolled to a stop. Arabella looked out to see an imposing manor house rising before them, its windows glowing with welcoming light. This was Ashford Park, her new home, a gilded cage, she thought bitterly. The Duke descended first and offered his hand to help her down. Arabella took it reluctantly, feeling the strength in his grip as he steadied her on the gravel drive. An army of servants had assembled to greet them, and she was introduced to them in a blur. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bridges, the butler, Jameson, various maids and footmen whose names she knew she would never remember. "Show her Grace to the Duchess's chambers," the Duke instructed Mrs. Bridges. "She must be exhausted from the journey." Mrs. Bridges, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, curtsied and gestured for Arabella to follow. As they climbed the grand staircase, Arabella glanced back to see the Duke standing in the entrance hall, watching her ascend with an unreadable expression. The Duchess's chambers were magnificent, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of blue and gold, with enormous windows overlooking the gardens. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the four-poster bed had been turned down invitingly. Sarah had arrived earlier with Arabella's trunks, and several gowns had already been unpacked and hung in the wardrobe. "Will you need anything else, Your Grace?" Mrs. Bridges asked. Arabella shook her head. "No, thank you. You've been most kind." When the door closed behind the housekeeper, Arabella finally allowed herself to collapse onto the edge of the bed. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave, and she buried her face in her hands. She had entered this marriage knowing it would be difficult, but she had not imagined this, to be wed to a man who saw her not as a person but as an instrument of revenge. A door on the far side of the room caught her attention, presumably the connecting door to the Duke's chambers. Tradition held that on a wedding night a husband would visit his bride to consummate the marriage. The thought filled Arabella with a mixture of dread and confusion. Would he come to her tonight? Did he intend to claim all his rights as a husband, even though he had made his hatred for her family abundantly clear? She rose and changed into her nightgown, a delicate creation of white lawn and lace that her mother had commissioned for this occasion. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back, and climbed into the enormous bed. The linens were fine and soft, scented with lavender. In any other circumstances, it would have been the height of luxury. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers, and still the connecting door remained closed. Arabella lay awake, her ears straining for any sound of movement from the adjacent room. But there was nothing, only silence and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Arabella understood. He would not come to her. Whatever rights he might claim as her husband, he evidently had no intention of exercising them this night. Whether this was a blessing or an insult, she could not say. She only knew that she was alone, more alone than she had ever been, in a stranger's house, bound to a man who despised everything about her. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to find full morning sunlight streaming through the windows and Sarah bustling about the room, laying out clothes for the day. "Good morning, Your Grace," Sarah said cheerfully. "I trust you slept well? Mrs. Bridges says breakfast is served in the morning-room whenever you're ready." Arabella sat up, feeling the weight of her new title. Your Grace. She was a duchess now, whether she felt worthy of the position or not. "Thank you, Sarah. The rose morning dress, I think." An hour later, properly dressed and coiffed, Arabella made her way downstairs. A footman directed her to the morning-room, a sunny chamber overlooking the rose gardens. The Duke was already there, seated at the head of the table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He rose when she entered, his manners impeccable even if his heart was cold. "Good morning, madam. I trust you found your chambers comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Arabella replied, taking the seat that a footman held for her, "though I confess I found the bed rather large for one person." It was a bold statement, a direct challenge. If he noticed the barb, he gave no sign. Instead, he resumed his seat and returned to his newspaper. "You will find that as Duchess of Ashford, you have considerable responsibilities. Mrs. Bridges will familiarize you with the household management. I expect you to take your duties seriously." "I always take my duties seriously, Your Grace," Arabella said quietly. "Unlike some, I do not enter into commitments lightly or with ulterior motives." That got his attention. He lowered the newspaper, fixing her with those penetrating grey eyes. "If you have something to say to me, madam, say it plainly." "Very well. You have made me your wife for the sole purpose of tormenting my father. But I am not my father, Your Grace. Whatever sins he may have committed, I am innocent of them. Yet you have punished me as though I were equally guilty. Is that the action of an honorable man?" A flash of anger crossed his features. "Do not speak to me of honor. Your father—" "My father is my father, and I am myself," Arabella interrupted, her own temper rising. "I have my own mind, my own conscience. I have done nothing to harm you or your family. Yet you have treated me with contempt and cruelty, all because of an old grievance. If you wished for revenge, you might have found it in a dozen ways that did not require dragging an innocent woman into your schemes." "Innocent?" The Duke's voice was harsh. "You have lived in luxury all your life on money stolen from my family. Every gown you wore, every meal you ate, was paid for with my father's wealth. How innocent can you claim to be? I was a child when these events occurred." Arabella's voice rose, her composure finally cracking. "I knew nothing of business dealings or investments. I knew only that I had a father and a mother and sisters, and that we were reasonably comfortable. If my father committed crimes, that is his burden to bear, not mine." The Duke stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For a moment he towered over her, and Arabella wondered if she had pushed him too far. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled, though she could hear the fury beneath. "You want to be treated as separate from your father? Very well. You are the Duchess of Ashford now. You will comport yourself with the dignity that position requires. You will manage this household, attend necessary social functions, and maintain the appearance of a proper marriage. In return, you will want for nothing material. You will have pin money, gowns, jewels, everything a woman of your station requires. But do not expect warmth from me, madam. Do not expect affection or companionship. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." "Then why marry at all?" Arabella demanded, rising to face him. "You could have had your revenge through business dealings, through social machinations. Why bind yourself to me for life if you find the prospect so distasteful?" For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features, something that looked almost like pain. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his customary coldness. "Because this ensures your father will never be free of me. Because every time he sees us together, he will remember what his actions cost him. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because you are the one thing he values more than his own worthless skin. In taking you from him, in binding you to me, I take the one thing he truly treasures and place it forever beyond his reach." The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Arabella felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not give him that victory. "Then I pity you, Your Grace," she said softly. for you have allowed hatred to consume you so completely that you cannot see the damage you do to yourself. My father may be guilty of many things, but at least he is still capable of love. You have walled yourself off so completely that I wonder if you remember what it means to feel anything but anger." She turned and left the room before he could respond, walking with measured steps even though every instinct screamed at her to run. Behind her, she heard the sharp crack of something, a coffee cup, perhaps, being thrown against the wall, and she allowed herself a grim smile. At least she had managed to penetrate that icy composure. The days that followed established a pattern that Arabella suspected would define her marriage. She threw herself into learning the management of Ashford Park, working closely with Mrs. Bridges to understand the complexities of running such a large estate. She discovered that she had a talent for household management, finding satisfaction in bringing order to the various departments and resolving conflicts between staff members. The Duke, meanwhile, spent his days in his study attending to business matters or riding across the estate lands. They saw each other at meals, where they maintained a facade of civility, and occasionally in the evenings, when propriety demanded they spend time together in the drawing-room. But they never spoke of anything personal, never moved beyond the most superficial pleasantries. Arabella explored her new home, finding unexpected beauty in its architecture and grounds. The library was particularly magnificent, containing thousands of volumes that the Duke appeared to have actually read, if the worn spines and bookmarked pages were any indication. She began spending her afternoons there, losing herself in novels and poetry, finding escape in fictional worlds where love conquered all and virtue was rewarded. 3 weeks after their wedding, Arabella received a letter from her father. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, uncertain what she would find. The letter was brief and painfully awkward. "My dearest Arabella, I hope this letter finds you well and that you are settling into your new position. Your mother and sisters send their love and ask constantly after you. I wanted to write to express my gratitude for the sacrifice you have made for our family. I know the Duke is perhaps not the husband you might have chosen for yourself, but he is an honorable man, and I trust he will treat you well. Please know that I am aware of how much we owe you. You have saved us all, and I will never forget it. Your loving father." Arabella stared at the letter, reading and rereading those lines. An honorable man. Her father clearly had no idea that the Duke knew the truth about his past deeds. Or perhaps he suspected but hoped that 20 years of silence had buried the truth deeply enough that it would never resurface. Either way, the letter made clear that her father saw her marriage as a triumph, not the trap it truly was. She was still holding the letter when the Duke entered the library. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze moving from her face to the paper in her hands. "News from your family?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "From my father," Arabella confirmed. "He writes to thank me for my sacrifice and to express his confidence that you will treat me well." She met his eyes directly. "Shall I write back and tell him how accurate his assessment has been?" A muscle ticked in the Duke's jaw. "You may write whatever you wish. I have no intention of dictating your correspondence." "How generous of you." Arabella set the letter aside. "Tell me something, Your Grace. When you uncovered this evidence of my father's crimes, did you consider pursuing legal action? Or did you decide immediately that marriage would be a more satisfying form of revenge?" The evidence was old, and some of the other parties involved had died. A legal case would have been difficult to prove and might have failed. This was more certain. More certain to cause maximum suffering, you mean? Arabella rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens. "I have been thinking about what you told me, about the fraud and its impact on your father. I want you to know that I do not defend my father's actions if what you say is true. No amount of financial gain justifies betraying a friend's trust." She turned to face him. "But I also want you to understand something. I am not responsible for his choices, just as you are not responsible for your father's pain. We are our own people, capable of choosing our own paths, and I choose not to perpetuate this cycle of hatred." "What exactly are you proposing?" The Duke's voice was wary. "I am proposing that we attempt to build something new. Not the marriage of affection I once hoped for. I am not so naive as to believe that possible now. But perhaps something less poisonous than what we currently have. A partnership, perhaps. Mutual respect, if not warmth. We are bound together for life, Your Grace. Must we make each other miserable for all those years to come?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not read. "You surprise me, Lady Arabella. I expected tears and hysterics, not this. This. Strength. Dignity. Most women in your position would have collapsed into despair by now." "Then you do not know women very well, Your Grace." Arabella returned to her chair, sitting with perfect posture. "We are raised to be resilient, to adapt to whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. It is one of the few gifts society allows us. I may not have chosen this situation, but I can choose how I respond to it." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a crack in his armor of anger. He moved closer, taking a seat across from her rather than maintaining his usual distance. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "My mother. She died when I was very young, but I remember her strength. My father's betrayal and subsequent decline broke his spirit, but she never wavered. She held our household together through sheer force of will until consumption took her when I was 12. It was the first personal thing he had shared with her, the first glimpse beneath his cold facade." Arabella felt her own guard lowering slightly in response. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "To lose a mother so young must have been devastating." "It was. And then to lose my father just 5 years later." He trailed off, his eyes distant with memory. "I was 17 and suddenly a duke, with an estate to run and tenants depending on me. I had to grow up very quickly." "As did I in my own way," Arabella said. "When I was 15, I discovered my father's gambling debts. I confronted him, begged him to stop. He promised he would, but of course he didn't. From that moment, I knew that my future would be determined by his weaknesses rather than my own wishes." They sat in silence for a moment, two people scarred by their parents' failings, bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. For the first time since their wedding, Arabella felt a fragile connection forming. Not affection, perhaps, but understanding. "I cannot forget what your father did to mine," the Duke said finally. "I cannot simply forgive and move forward as though it never happened." "I don't ask you to," Arabella replied. "Your feelings are your own, and you're entitled to them. But I am asking you to see me as separate from him, to give me a chance to prove that I am not defined by my father's sins." The Duke's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw genuine consideration rather than cold dismissal. "And if I were to grant you that chance, what would you want from this marriage?" Arabella considered carefully before answering. "Respect. Honesty. The freedom to be myself rather than merely a symbol of your revenge. And perhaps, in time, friendship. I don't ask for love. I understand that may be impossible given our circumstances. But surely friendship is not too much to hope for." "Friendship," the Duke repeated, as though testing the word. "I had friends once, before I learned how easily trust can be betrayed. It is not something I give lightly." "Nor do I," Arabella assured him. "But we have time, Your Grace. Years stretching ahead of us. We can take it slowly, one day at a time. Perhaps we'll surprise ourselves." The Duke rose, and Arabella thought the conversation was over. But he paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that was almost curious. "You may call me Adrian," he said. "If we are to attempt this partnership you speak of, it seems absurd to maintain such formality in private." Arabella felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. "And you may call me Arabella, though perhaps not in company, for appearance's sake." "For appearance's sake," he agreed. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Then he was gone, leaving Arabella alone with her thoughts and the beginnings of something she hadn't expected, possibility. Over the following weeks, their relationship began to shift in subtle ways. Adrian still maintained his distance, still retreated to his study for hours at a time. But he began to linger at meals, engaging Arabella in conversations that went beyond mere pleasantries. They discussed books they had read, philosophical questions, estate management. Arabella discovered that beneath his cold exterior, Adrian possessed a sharp intellect and a dry sense of humor that occasionally surprised a laugh from her. One afternoon, Arabella was in the rose garden, pruning back overgrown bushes under the head gardener's instruction, when Adrian appeared on the path. She straightened, wiping soil from her gloved hands. "You've taken to gardening now?" he asked, and there was amusement in his voice rather than mockery. Mrs. Whitmore was explaining the care of these heritage roses. "I find I enjoy working with growing things. It's peaceful." She gestured to the riot of blooms surrounding them, deep crimsons, soft pinks, pure whites. "These bushes are over 100 years old. Mrs. Whitmore says your grandmother planted them." "I didn't know that." Adrian moved closer, examining the flowers with new interest. "I confess I've taken the gardens rather for granted. I see you're making improvements throughout the estate." It was true. In the month since her arrival, Arabella had been carefully implementing changes, modernizing the kitchen, reorganizing the linen storage, establishing a small school in the village for tenant children. She had expected resistance from Adrian, but he had approved each proposal without argument. "I hope I haven't overstepped," she said carefully. "This is your home, after all." "It's our home," Adrian corrected, and the word "our" sent a small thrill through her. "You're the Duchess. The household is your domain. I'm impressed, actually, with what you've accomplished." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her, and Arabella felt a flush of pleasure. "Thank you. I've tried to be respectful of the existing traditions while making necessary improvements." They began walking together along the garden paths, their steps naturally falling into rhythm. Adrian pointed out various features of the grounds, sharing stories from his childhood that gradually painted a picture of a boy who had been happy once, before loss and betrayal had hardened him. "I used to hide in that gazebo when my tutors were looking for me," he admitted, pointing to a small structure half hidden by climbing roses. "I would bring books and spend entire afternoons there, reading about adventures in far-off lands." "What sort of adventures?" Arabella asked, genuinely curious. "Exploration narratives, mostly. Tales of men who had traveled to Africa, the Orient, the Americas. I dreamed of seeing those places myself someday." He smiled slightly, a real smile that transformed his face. "Foolish boyhood fantasies." "Not foolish at all," Arabella protested. "Why shouldn't you travel if you wish? You're a duke, master of your own destiny." "Responsibilities," Adrian said simply. "The estate, business interests, obligations to tenants and Parliament. There's always something that needs attention." "Perhaps," Arabella said thoughtfully, "you've allowed duty to consume your entire existence, just as you've allowed anger at my father to define your choices." His expression shuddered slightly. "You don't understand." "I understand that you've built a prison for yourself," Arabella interrupted gently. "Walled yourself off from joy, from possibility, from anything that might make you vulnerable. You've let one man's betrayal poison your entire life." Adrian stopped walking, his jaw tight. "You presume too much." "Do I?" Then tell me, when was the last time you did something simply because it brought you pleasure? When did you last laugh freely, or pursue a dream, or allow yourself to care for someone without calculating the potential cost? He was silent, and Arabella pressed her advantage. You married me to punish my father, yes. But in doing so, you've also punished yourself. You've bound yourself to a woman you claimed to despise, trapped yourself in a loveless marriage, all for the sake of revenge. Who truly suffers more from that arrangement? This conversation is over, Adrian said coldly, turning to leave. Running away? Arabella called after him. How unlike the fearsome Duke of Ashford, who faces everything with such cold resolve. He stopped but didn't turn back. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. You think you understand me after a few weeks of marriage? You know nothing of what drives me, of what I've endured. Then help me understand, Arabella said, moving to stand before him. Talk to me, Adrian, not as your instrument of revenge, but as your wife, as someone who is trying, against all odds, to build something meaningful from this disaster we've both found ourselves in. For a long moment they stood facing each other in the dappled sunlight of the garden, the air between them charged with tension. Then, unexpectedly, Adrian's shoulders sagged slightly, as though some great weight had momentarily proved too much. My father was a good man, he said quietly. Kind, principled, generous to a fault. When your father betrayed him, it wasn't just the money he lost, it was his faith in humanity. He became suspicious of everyone, withdrew from society, stopped trusting even his oldest friends. He died alone and bitter, and I had to watch him fade away, powerless to help him. And you've been carrying that pain ever since, Arabella said softly. Every day. For 20 years, I've lived with the knowledge that somewhere your father was laughing at what he'd done, living comfortably on stolen wealth while my father died of a broken heart. Adrian's voice cracked slightly. And I swore that someday, somehow, I would make him pay. Arabella's heart ached for the boy he had been, watching his father's decline. But she also felt a flash of anger at the man he had become, who had let that pain turn him cruel. And now you have, she said. You've married his daughter, taken her away from him, made her your property by law. You've achieved your revenge. So what happens now, Adrian? Do you spend the rest of your life maintaining this cold distance? Do you hold on to your anger forever, letting it consume whatever chance at happiness you might find? I don't know, he admitted, and there was something raw in his voice, something vulnerable. I've been working toward this moment for so long, I never thought beyond it. I never considered what would come after. Then perhaps it's time to start considering it, Arabella suggested. Because I am here, and I am real, and I am not going anywhere. We are married, Adrian. For better or worse, until death parts us. That is an inescapable fact. The only question is what kind of marriage we choose to have. Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. You're nothing like I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone weaker. Someone who would crumble under the weight of this situation. Your father's daughter, in truth. Selfish, unprincipled, concerned only with comfort and status. He shook his head. But you're not like that at all. You're strong. Resilient. You face difficulties head-on rather than retreating from them. My mother taught me that strength isn't about never falling, it's about always getting back up, Arabella said. Besides, what choice do I have? I can either accept defeat and live in misery, or I can fight to create something better. I choose to fight. Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a softening, a thawing. I haven't been fair to you, he said slowly. You're right about that. You are not your father, and I should not have treated you as though you were responsible for his crimes. Thank you, Arabella said, feeling the words land with genuine weight. That means more than you know. I cannot promise you love, Adrian continued. I don't know if I'm still capable of it. But I can promise to treat you with respect, to give you the dignity you deserve as my wife and as a person in your own right. That's all I ask, Arabella said. Well, that and perhaps the occasional civil conversation. To her surprise, Adrian smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I think I can manage that. They returned to walking, the tension between them eased if not entirely gone. As they rounded a bend in the path, they encountered the head gardener, who quickly bowed. "Your Graces, I was just coming to find you, my lady. We've had a letter from your father. It was delivered to the gardens by mistake." Arabella took the letter, noting the urgency of the seal. She broke it open and read quickly, her face paling with each line. "What is it?" Adrian asked, seeing her distress. "It's my youngest sister, Caroline. She's fallen ill with scarlet fever. The doctors fear—" Arabella couldn't finish the sentence, her voice breaking. Adrian's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. "We'll leave at once. I'll have the coach readied immediately." "You would do that?" Arabella looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "Even though you hate my family?" "I don't hate your sisters," Adrian said firmly. "They're innocent children who have done nothing wrong. And you care for them, which is reason enough. Come, we must hurry." Within an hour, they were on the road, racing toward Thornwood Hall. Arabella sat rigid with worry, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Adrian sat beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, he reached over and took one of her hands in his. "She'll be all right," he said quietly. "Scarlet fever is serious, but children often recover." "She's only 8 years old," Arabella whispered. "So small and fragile. I should have been there. I should have. You couldn't have known. And you're going to her now. That's what matters." Arabella looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. It was the first time he had touched her with genuine tenderness since their wedding-day kiss. She held on tightly, drawing comfort from the contact. They arrived at Thornwood Hall in the early hours of the morning. The house was eerily quiet, with none of the usual bustle of servants. Arabella burst through the door, not waiting for anyone to admit them, and ran straight to the nursery wing. Her mother met her in the hallway, her face lined with exhaustion and worry. "Arabella, thank God you've come. How is she?" Arabella demanded. "The fever broke an hour ago. The doctor says she's past the worst of it, but she's very weak." Lady Thornwood embraced her daughter. "She's been asking for you." Arabella rushed into the sick-room, where little Caroline lay in bed, her face pale but peaceful in sleep. Her other sister, Margaret, sat beside the bed, keeping vigil. Margaret looked up as Arabella entered. "Bella!" she exclaimed quietly, rising to embrace her sister. "I'm so glad you're here. Caroline will be so happy when she wakes." Arabella sank into the chair beside the bed, taking her youngest sister's small hand. "I'm here, darling," she whispered. "Your Bella is here." Behind her, Adrian stood in the doorway, watching the scene. Lady Thornwood approached him cautiously. "Your Grace, I cannot thank you enough for bringing Arabella to us so quickly. I know you must have many demands on your time." "Families should be together in times of crisis," Adrian said simply. He glanced toward where Arabella sat, her attention entirely focused on her sister. "Your daughter has been anxious with worry the entire journey." "She loves her sisters dearly," Lady Thornwood said. "They've always been close. When she married you and had to leave—" She trailed off, perhaps remembering the circumstances of the marriage. "She has not mentioned me unkindly, I hope?" Adrian asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. Lady Thornwood studied him carefully. "She has said very little about her marriage, Your Grace. Only that you are adjusting to one another. I had feared, given the circumstances." She seemed to struggle for words. "Given that it was an arranged marriage born of financial necessity?" Adrian supplied. "Yes, our beginning was less than ideal. But your daughter is a remarkable woman, Lady Thornwood. She has handled a difficult situation with grace and dignity." "I'm glad to hear it," Lady Thornwood said softly. "She deserves happiness, Your Grace. Whatever my husband's failings, Arabella has always been blameless." The words hung in the air between them. Adrian looked at the older woman, seeing the worry lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her hair. She, too, was a victim of Lord Thornwood's choices, he realized. Perhaps even more so than Arabella. "I have not always been fair to your daughter," Adrian admitted. "But I am learning. She is teaching me." A small smile touched Lady Thornwood's lips. "That sounds like Arabella. She never could resist a challenge." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as Arabella stroked her sister's hair and murmured soft words of comfort. After a few moments, Caroline stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Bella?" she whispered weakly. "I'm here, dearest," Arabella said, leaning close. "I came as soon as I heard you were ill." "I had the most terrible dreams," Caroline said. "I dreamed you had gone away and would never come back." "Never," Arabella assured her, kissing her sister's forehead. "I will always come back to you." "Always? Even though you're a duchess now?" Caroline asked, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "Even though I'm a duchess. You're my sister, Caroline. Nothing will ever change that." Caroline's gaze drifted to the doorway, where Adrian stood. "Is that the Duke? Your husband?" Adrian stepped forward, moving to stand beside Arabella's chair. He looked down at the small girl, seeing the curiosity in her fever-bright eyes. "I am," he confirmed. "And you must be Lady Caroline. Your sister has told me much about you." "Really? Did she say I'm terrible at pianoforte but excellent at mathematics?" Despite himself, Adrian smiled. "She may have mentioned something of that nature. Mamma says I'm not ladylike enough. But Bella always said I should be good at what I'm good at, and not worry about what I'm bad at." Caroline looked at her sister adoringly. "Bella understands everything." "She does seem to have remarkable insight," Adrian agreed, his eyes meeting Arabella's over the child's head. They stayed at Thornwood Hall for 3 days, until Caroline was well enough to be out of danger. During that time, Adrian observed Arabella with her family, seeing a side of her he hadn't glimpsed before. She was patient with her sisters, affectionate with her mother, and even managed to maintain civility with her father, though Adrian noticed a certain guardedness in her interactions with Lord Thornwood. For his part, Lord Thornwood seemed uncomfortable in Adrian's presence, avoiding direct conversation whenever possible. Once, Adrian caught the older man watching him with an expression that might have been fear or guilt or perhaps both. Their eyes met across the drawing-room, and Lord Thornwood quickly looked away, his face reddening. Good, Adrian thought with grim satisfaction. Let him be uncomfortable. Let him wonder how much I know. But even as he thought it, Adrian felt a stirring of doubt. Watching Arabella with her family, seeing the love they shared despite their difficulties, he began to question his quest for vengeance. What purpose did it serve, really? Lord Thornwood was already a broken man, enslaved to his own weaknesses. The fraud he had committed had indeed been terrible, but it had happened 20 years ago. Everyone involved except Adrian and Lord Thornwood himself had either died or moved on. Was he, as Arabella had suggested, simply imprisoning himself in his own anger? On the third evening, after Caroline had been declared well enough to resume light activities, Adrian found himself alone with Arabella in the Thornwood library. She had been reading to her sister earlier and had come to return the book to its shelf. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for bringing me here. For staying. I know it must have been difficult for you, being in this house, near my father." "It was less difficult than I expected," Adrian admitted. "Your family is not what I imagined." "What did you imagine?" "I don't know. People who were more like your father, perhaps. Selfish, unprincipled. But your mother is kind, your sister's delightful. Even you—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Even me what?" Arabella prompted. "Even you are nothing like what I expected when I planned this marriage. I thought I would be binding myself to someone shallow and spoiled, someone who deserved to be trapped in a loveless union. But you're not that person, Arabella. You never were." Arabella set the book aside, turning to face him fully. "Are you saying you regret marrying me?" "No," Adrian said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "I'm saying I regret my reasons for doing so. I'm saying I wish I had met you under different circumstances, without the shadow of our father's history hanging over us." "But we didn't," Arabella said practically. "We met exactly as we did, under exactly the circumstances that existed. We can't change the past, Adrian. We can only decide how we move forward from here." Adrian moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "And how do you suggest we move forward?" "Honestly," Arabella said, "without pretense or games. You've begun to see me as a person rather than a pawn in your revenge. I've begun to understand the pain that has driven your actions. Perhaps that's enough of a foundation to build something on." "Something like what?" "I don't know yet, but something more than what we had. Something that might, eventually, resemble a real marriage." Adrian reached out, hesitating for just a moment before tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It was an intimate gesture, tender in a way that surprised them both. "You asked me once when I last did something simply because it brought me pleasure," he said quietly. "I find that talking with you, spending time in your company, it brings me a kind of peace I haven't felt in years." "Is that a start?" Arabella's breath caught. "Yes," she whispered. "That's a start." For a moment they stood suspended in possibility, the air between them charged with something that felt dangerously like hope. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway, and they stepped apart, the spell broken but not forgotten. They returned to Ashford Park the following day, with promises to visit again soon, and with Arabella's mother and sisters planning to come for an extended stay once Caroline was fully recovered. The journey back felt different from their wedding journey, less fraught, more companionable. They talked of small things, improvements to be made at Ashford Park, books they wanted to read, the upcoming season in London. In the weeks that followed, their relationship continued to evolve. Adrian began joining Arabella in the library in the evenings, and they would read together in comfortable silence. Sometimes they would discuss what they were reading, their conversations ranging from philosophy to poetry to the latest agricultural innovations. Adrian also began to teach Arabella about estate management, explaining the various investments and business interests that maintained the Ashford fortune. Arabella proved to have an excellent head for numbers and strategy, offering insights that Adrian found surprisingly valuable. "You should have been born male," he commented one afternoon as they reviewed ledgers together. "You have a better mind for business than half the men in Parliament." "What a ridiculous notion," Arabella countered. "My mind is exactly as it should be. It's society that's ridiculous for assuming women can't understand such matters." Adrian laughed, a real, genuine laugh that startled them both. "You're absolutely right. Forgive my thoughtless comment. I will, if you promise to take my suggestions seriously in the future." "I always take your suggestions seriously," Adrian protested. "I implemented your idea about the tenant farming cooperatives, didn't I? After arguing with me for a week about it." "I wasn't arguing. I was ensuring we had considered all possibilities." But he was smiling as he said it, and Arabella smiled back. These small moments of connection accumulated gradually, building something fragile but genuine between them. They began to feel like partners, like a team working toward common goals. The physical distance between them remained. Adrian still kept to his own chambers, and they had never consummated their marriage, but the emotional distance was slowly closing. Then, 2 months after their wedding, everything changed. Arabella had gone to visit a tenant family whose cottage had been damaged in a storm. She stayed longer than intended, helping the wife clean up debris and mind the children while the husband repaired the roof. By the time she started back to the main house, dusk was falling and a light rain had begun. The path through the woods was slippery with mud and fallen leaves. Arabella was hurrying, not wanting to worry the household with her lateness, when her foot caught on a root. She fell hard, crying out as pain shot through her ankle. She tried to rise but couldn't put weight on her injured foot. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through her dress. Night was falling rapidly, and she was still half a mile from the house with no way to walk. Panic started to set in, but Arabella forced herself to remain calm. She called out, hoping someone might be within earshot, but heard nothing except the rain and wind. She tried again to stand, gritting her teeth against the pain, but her ankle simply wouldn't support her weight. She had just resigned herself to attempting to crawl when she heard hoofbeats. A moment later, Adrian came around the bend, riding hard, his face a mask of worry. "Arabella!" He was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her in the mud, his hands running over her with urgent care. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "My ankle," she managed through chattering teeth. "I fell. I can't walk on it." Without a word, Adrian scooped her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. "Hold on to me," he commanded, and Arabella wrapped her arms around his neck as he carried her to his horse. Somehow, he managed to mount while still holding her, settling her sideways across his lap before spurring the horse toward home. Arabella pressed her face against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the rapid beating of his heart. His arms held her securely, one hand splayed across her back, the other supporting her legs. Despite the rain and the pain, she felt safe. "How did you know?" she asked as they rode. "Mrs. Bridges said you hadn't returned. When it started raining, I knew something must be wrong. You're never late without sending word." His voice was rough with emotion. "When I couldn't find you on the main paths, I feared—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his arms tightened around her. They reached the house, and Adrian carried her straight upstairs to her chambers, shouting orders for hot water, bandages, and the doctor to be sent for. He laid her gently on the bed, then began efficiently removing her wet boots, his hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "I don't think it's broken," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Badly sprained, perhaps. We'll know more when the doctor arrives." Sarah bustled in with hot water and towels, but Adrian waved her away. "I'll tend to her. Bring dry clothes and something warm to drink." When they were alone, Adrian helped Arabella out of her wet dress, his movements careful and respectful, averting his eyes when necessary. He wrapped her in a warm dressing gown, then sat beside her on the bed, carefully binding her ankle. "You could have died out there," he said quietly, not looking at her. "If you'd been injured more seriously, if you'd been caught in the storm all night." "But I wasn't," Arabella said softly. "You found me. I should have gone with you. I should have insisted." His hands trembled slightly as he finished wrapping her ankle. "When I couldn't find you, when I thought something might have happened to you, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Arabella reached out and took his hand. "You what?" Adrian finally met her eyes, and what she saw there stole her breath. It wasn't anger or coldness or calculated control. It was fear, raw and genuine, and beneath it, something that looked remarkably like affection. "I realized," he said slowly, "that somewhere along the way, this stopped being about revenge. That you've become important to me, Arabella. That the thought of losing you was unbearable." Arabella's heart pounded. "Adrian, I know I have no right to feel this way," he continued, the words tumbling out as though he'd been holding them back for too long. "I know I've treated you abominably, that I married you for all the wrong reasons. But you've been so patient with me, so determined to see good in me even when I gave you every reason not to. And somehow you've made me want to be better, to be the man you seem to think I can be." "I don't think you can be that man," Arabella said softly. "I know you already are. You've just been hiding it beneath layers of anger and pain." Adrian raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I don't know if I can love," he admitted. "I've spent so long teaching myself not to feel, to keep everyone at a distance. But with you I want to try. If you'll have me. If you'll give me a chance to be a real husband to you." Tears sprang to Arabella's eyes. "I never stopped hoping for that," she whispered. "Even when things were at their worst, even when you were cruel, some part of me kept hoping that we might find our way to each other." Adrian cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away her tears. "You're extraordinary. Do you know that? Anyone else would have given up on me, would have settled for a cold, distant marriage. But not you. You kept pushing, kept insisting that we could be more." "Because I saw glimpses of who you really are," Arabella said. "In those moments when you forgot to guard yourself, when you laughed at something I said, or got excited explaining some business strategy, or showed kindness to someone in need. I saw the real you, Adrian, and I wanted more of him." "Then you shall have him," Adrian promised. "All of him, such as he is. I can't promise I'll be perfect. I'll probably still be stubborn and difficult at times. But I can promise that I'll try, that I'll work every day to be worthy of you." He leaned down then, and unlike their wedding kiss, cold and calculated and meant to hurt, this kiss was warm and tender and full of promise. Arabella's hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, and Adrian made a sound low in his throat that might have been relief or joy or both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "I should let you rest. The doctor will be here soon." "Stay with me," Arabella requested. "Please. Just until he arrives." Adrian nodded, settling beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders. Arabella leaned into his warmth, feeling safer and more content than she had in months. Outside, the storm raged on, but here in this room, something new was beginning, something fragile and precious and worth protecting. The doctor arrived shortly and confirmed Adrian's assessment, a bad sprain but nothing broken. He prescribed rest and cold compresses, and strict orders not to walk on the ankle for at least a week. When he left, Adrian personally carried Arabella to the chaise by the window, arranging pillows and blankets around her with endearing fussiness. "You're hovering," Arabella observed with amusement. "I'm ensuring you're comfortable," Adrian corrected. "There's a difference." "If you say so, Your Grace." "I thought we agreed you'd call me Adrian in private." "We did, but you're being so ducal at the moment that I couldn't resist." Arabella smiled up at him. "Though I appreciate the care, truly. It's nice to be fussed over." Adrian sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "Get used to it. I intend to fuss over you quite a bit in the coming days." "Only in the coming days?" "Well, I may have to reduce the fussing once you've recovered. I do have an estate to run, after all." But his eyes were warm, and Arabella knew he was teasing. They spent the evening together, talking more openly than they ever had before. Adrian told her about his childhood, about his mother's death and his father's decline. He spoke of the loneliness of being a young duke, the weight of responsibility, the way he'd hardened himself against feeling to protect himself from more pain. In turn, Arabella shared her own struggles, the shame of her father's gambling, the constant worry about money, the burden of knowing she would likely have to marry for advantage rather than love. She told him about the dreams she'd had as a girl, of finding a partner who would see her as an equal, who would value her mind as much as her face or family connections. "I think I've misjudged you," Adrian said when she finished. "I assumed you were like the other ladies of the ton, concerned only with gowns and balls and securing an advantageous match. But you're so much more than that." "Most women are," Arabella pointed out. "We're not given many options for how to spend our intelligence or energy. We're trained from childhood to focus on appearance and accomplishments that will attract husbands. But that doesn't mean we don't have depths beyond that." "I'm beginning to realize that." Adrian lifted her hand to his lips again, a gesture that was becoming familiar and welcome. "Thank you for being patient with me, for seeing past my worst behavior to something worth salvaging." "There was always something worth salvaging," Arabella assured him. "I just had to help you see it too." Over the following week, as Arabella's ankle healed, their bond deepened further. Adrian moved a desk into her sitting room so he could work while keeping her company. They took meals together, read aloud to each other, and talked endlessly about everything and nothing. Adrian also began to open up about his business interests, sharing his strategies and seeking Arabella's input. She proved to have keen insights into market trends and human nature, and more than once, her suggestions led to profitable outcomes. "You're a natural," Adrian told her after one particularly successful investment. "If you'd been born male, you could have been a force in the city." "If I'd been born male, I wouldn't have had to develop these skills," Arabella countered. "Women learn to read people because our survival often depends on it. We learn strategy because we must achieve our goals through indirect means. In some ways, society's limitations have made me better at this than I might otherwise have been." "That's a remarkably philosophical way of viewing oppression," Adrian observed. "What's the alternative? Railing against circumstances I cannot change? I prefer to make the best of what I have." She smiled at him. "Though I notice you've been remarkably progressive in your dealings with me, treating me as an intellectual equal, asking my opinions on business matters. That's unusual for a man of your class." "Perhaps that's because you've taught me that intelligence has no gender," Adrian said. "Or perhaps it's because I've come to value your mind as much as—" He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. "As much as what?" Arabella prompted, enjoying his discomfort. "As much as your other qualities," Adrian finished, looking away. "Adrian Blackwell, are you blushing?" "Certainly not. Dukes don't blush. This one apparently does." Arabella laughed, delighted. "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. Your reputation as a cold, intimidating duke is safe with me." "I don't care about that reputation anymore," Adrian said, turning back to her with unexpected seriousness. "I only care what you think of me." The laughter faded from Arabella's face, replaced by something softer. "I think you're remarkable. I think you're brave enough to admit when you're wrong and strong enough to change. I think you're becoming the man you were meant to be before pain taught you to hide your heart." Adrian moved closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "And what else do you think?" "I think," Arabella said softly, her eyes on his lips, "that you should kiss me again." Adrian needed no further invitation. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was deeper and more passionate than the one they'd shared the week before. Arabella's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Adrian groaned, his arms coming around her to hold her against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "Your ankle," he said, his voice rough. We shouldn't. You need to rest." "My ankle is fine," Arabella assured him. "And I've been resting for a week." "I think I've rested quite enough." Adrian laughed, a sound of pure joy that Arabella had never heard from him before. "You're going to be trouble, aren't you?" "Constantly," Arabella promised. "I hope you're prepared for it." "I don't think anything could have prepared me for you," Adrian admitted. "But I'm grateful for you anyway. For all of this. I never expected." He trailed off, seeming unable to find the words. "Neither did I," Arabella said, understanding. "But here we are." "Here we are," Adrian echoed, and kissed her again. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Adrian stayed with Arabella in her chambers. They talked late into the night, sharing confidences and dreams, building the foundation of intimacy that their marriage had lacked. And when Adrian finally carried her to bed, treating her injured ankle with exaggerated care, Arabella felt a completeness she had never expected to find. This was nothing like the cold business arrangement she had feared. This was partnership, companionship, the beginning of something that might truly become love. In the weeks that followed, their relationship continued to blossom. Adrian was attentive and affectionate, finding small ways to show he cared. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy, arranged for her sisters to visit, and consulted her on every important decision regarding the estate. In public, he was the model of a devoted husband, and in private, he was even better, warm, funny, surprisingly playful when he let his guard down. Arabella, for her part, continued to challenge and inspire him. She pushed him to be more engaged with their tenants, to consider the social implications of his business decisions, to think beyond profit to the human cost of his choices. And Adrian listened, implementing many of her suggestions, finding that his life felt richer and more meaningful when guided by principles beyond mere accumulation of wealth and power. 3 months after their wedding, they attended their first major social event together, Lady Pembroke's ball, the same venue where they had first seen each other. As they entered the ballroom, all eyes turned to them. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford, one of the most talked-about couples of the season. "Ready," Adrian murmured, offering his arm. "With you?" "Always," Arabella replied, taking it. They made their way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and making polite conversation. Arabella noticed the speculative looks, the whispered comments behind fans. Everyone wanted to know if the marriage was a happy one, if the cold Duke had thawed for his young bride. Let them wonder, Arabella thought. The truth of their marriage was theirs alone, something private and precious that need not be put on display for the amusement of the ton. Midway through the evening, Lord Thornwood approached them. It was the first time Adrian had seen his father-in-law since Caroline's illness, and Arabella felt tension immediately flood through him. She squeezed his arm in silent support. "Your Grace, Arabella," Lord Thornwood said, bowing. "Might I have a word?" Adrian's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. They followed Lord Thornwood to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from listening ears. "I wanted to thank you," Lord Thornwood began, his voice unsteady, "for your kindness during Caroline's illness, and for the generosity you've shown our family. I know the circumstances of the marriage were complicated." "Complicated," Adrian repeated, his voice cold. "An interesting choice of words." Lord Thornwood paled slightly. "Your Grace, Father," Arabella interrupted gently, seeing where this was heading. Perhaps this conversation would be better held at another time. But Adrian shook his head. "No. If we're to move forward, some things need to be said." He fixed Lord Thornwood with a steady gaze. "I know what you did, my lord, 20 years ago, to my father. I've known for years." The color drained completely from Lord Thornwood's face. "Your Grace, I can explain." "Can you?" Adrian's voice was quiet but cutting. Can you explain how you convinced my father to invest his fortune in a fraudulent scheme? How you knew it was fraud and participated anyway? How you then denied all knowledge when the whole thing collapsed?" Lord Thornwood seemed to shrink before their eyes. "I was desperate. I had gambling debts even then, and I thought I could repay them with my share of the proceeds. I never meant for anyone to be hurt." "But they were hurt," Adrian said. "My father was devastated. It broke something in him, Lord Thornwood. He died a bitter, broken man because of what you did." "I know." Lord Thornwood's voice was barely a whisper. "I've lived with the guilt every day since. It's why I couldn't refuse when you proposed marriage to Arabella, even though I knew. I suspected you had discovered the truth." "You suspected correctly," Adrian confirmed. "I married your daughter to punish you, to make you understand what it feels like to lose something precious." Arabella felt as though she'd been struck. She had known this, of course. He'd told her as much on their wedding day. But hearing him state it so baldly to her father, admitting it openly, still hurt. Lord Thornwood's eyes filled with tears. "And have I been punished enough, Your Grace? Has my daughter suffered sufficiently for my sins?" "No," Adrian said, and Arabella felt her heart break. But then he continued, and his next words changed everything. "Because she hasn't suffered at all. At least, not in the way I intended. I meant to trap her in a loveless marriage, to make her miserable as a way of making you miserable. But I failed spectacularly." He turned to Arabella, taking her hand. "Your daughter is the most remarkable woman I've ever met. She refused to accept the cold marriage I tried to force upon her. She insisted on seeing good in me, on believing I could be better than my worst impulses. And somehow, impossibly, she was right. She made me see that holding on to hatred was only poisoning myself, not you." Adrian turned back to Lord Thornwood. "What you did was wrong. It was cruel and selfish, and it caused enormous harm. But punishing your innocent daughter for your crimes would have been equally wrong. I see that now. And I refuse to let your mistakes define my marriage or my life any longer." Lord Thornwood's tears were flowing freely now. "Your Grace, I don't know what to say. I've wanted to apologize for 20 years, but I was too much of a coward. What I did was unforgivable." "Perhaps it is," Adrian agreed. "But I find I no longer have the energy to hate you. It's exhausting, carrying that much anger. And it prevents me from fully embracing the life I have now, a life with a wife I'm coming to love, with possibilities I never imagined." Arabella's breath caught at the word love. Adrian glanced at her, his expression softening. "I won't pretend we'll be friends, Lord Thornwood," Adrian continued. "The past can't be erased, and trust, once broken, is not easily restored. But for Arabella's sake, for the sake of her mother and sisters, I'm willing to maintain civility, to allow you to be part of our lives, though you'll never have my confidence." "That's more than I deserve," Lord Thornwood said hoarsely. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your clemency and my daughter's love." With that, he bowed deeply and retreated, leaving Adrian and Arabella alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Arabella turned to face her husband fully. "Did you mean it?" she asked softly. "What you said about coming to love me?" Adrian took both her hands in his gray eyes intense. "I did. I know it's too soon, that we've only been married a few months. But, Arabella, you've changed everything for me. You've taught me that love isn't weakness, it's strength. That opening your heart doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you whole." "I love you too," Arabella said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you raced through the rain to find me. When I saw genuine fear in your eyes, when I realized you cared for me beyond what I represented in your revenge. But truly, I think I've been falling in love with you all along, even when you were being impossible." Adrian laughed, pulling her close. "Only you would fall in love with a man who treated you as abominably as I did." "You gave me glimpses of who you really were," Arabella said. "And I'm an eternal optimist. I couldn't help but hope those glimpses would become the whole picture." "They are now," Adrian promised. "Or they're becoming it, at least. I'm still learning how to be the man you deserve, but I'm trying." "That's all I ask," Arabella said. Then, with a mischievous smile, "though I would also appreciate it if you asked me to dance. We are at a ball, after all, and we've been monopolizing this corner for quite some time." Adrian bowed formally. "Lady Arabella, forgive me, Duchess Arabella, would you do me the honor of this dance? I thought you'd never ask, Your Grace." They moved on to the dance floor, and as Adrian took her in his arms for a waltz, Arabella felt the eyes of the Tun upon them. Let them watch, she thought. Let them see that the cold Duke of Ashford has thawed, that love can bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances. As they swept across the floor, perfectly in sync, Adrian leaned close and whispered, "Do you remember what I said to you at the altar?" "How could I forget?" Arabella replied. "You said you hated my family and my father with all your heart." "I want to say something different now," Adrian said. "Something to replace that terrible memory with a better one." "What's that?" Adrian smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "I love you with all my heart. You and whatever family we build together. That's my vow to you now, Arabella. Not the hollow words I spoke at our wedding, but this, a promise made freely, with full knowledge of what I'm pledging." Arabella felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "I accept your vow, Adrian. And I make the same one to you. I love you with all my heart, and I always will." They finished the dance in perfect harmony, and when the music ended, Adrian led her out onto the terrace for a breath of air. The gardens were lit with paper lanterns, casting a warm glow over the manicured hedges and flower beds. "I have something for you," Adrian said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring, a delicate band set with small diamonds that caught the light. "What's this?" Arabella asked, confused. "You already gave me a betrothal ring." "That ring was chosen by my solicitor as part of a business transaction," Adrian said. "This ring I chose myself, for my wife, the woman I love. I wanted you to have something that represents what we've become, not what we were forced to be." He slipped the ring onto her finger, right beside her wedding band. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "It's beautiful," Arabella whispered, admiring how the diamonds sparkled. "But, Adrian, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted. "I want to give you everything, Arabella. Not just material things, but my time, my attention, my heart. I want to spend the rest of our lives building something beautiful together." "We already are," Arabella said, reaching up to cup his face. "Every day we're building it. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment of understanding, it all adds up to something extraordinary." Adrian kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and passion and the joy of having found something precious when he'd least expected it. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. "We should return to the ball," Arabella said reluctantly. "People will talk if we're gone too long." "Let them talk," Adrian said. "I'm a duke. I'm allowed to be eccentric. Kissing your own wife on a terrace is hardly eccentric." "Then I'll have to try harder." Adrian grinned, an expression that made him look years younger. "Perhaps I'll dance with you twice more." "Cause a real scandal." "You wouldn't dare." "Try me." They returned to the ballroom, and true to his word, Adrian danced with Arabella twice more that evening, much to the shocked delight of the assembled guests. The Duke of Ashford, known for his cold demeanor and business acumen, was clearly besotted with his bride. The gossip columns the next day were full of speculation about the Ashfords' obvious affection, with several writers noting that it was refreshing to see a marriage of the ton that appeared to be based on genuine regard rather than mere convenience. If only they knew, Arabella thought as she read the papers over breakfast. If only they knew it had started as the worst kind of convenience, a marriage of revenge and retribution, and had somehow transformed into something real and precious. "What are you smiling about?" Adrian asked, looking up from his own newspaper. "Just thinking about how wrong everyone would be if they knew the truth of how our marriage began." "And how right they are about how it is now," Adrian added. He set aside his paper and came around the table to kiss the top of her head. "I have a meeting with the estate manager this morning, but I was thinking we might go riding this afternoon. If your ankle is up to it." "My ankle has been healed for weeks," Arabella reminded him. "You simply enjoy fussing over me." "Guilty as charged." Adrian smiled. "But you'll come riding anyway?" "Of course. I never turn down an opportunity to spend time with my husband." As Adrian left for his meeting, Arabella reflected on how much had changed in just a few short months. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing but duty and coldness, prepared to sacrifice her happiness for her family's security. Instead, she had found a partner who challenged and inspired her, who valued her mind as much as her appearance, who was capable of profound change when given the right motivation. Their path to happiness had been unconventional, marked by anger and pain and misunderstanding. But perhaps that made their current joy even sweeter. They had fought for this happiness, earned it through honesty and vulnerability and the willingness to see beyond their own hurt. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Bridges entered, looking concerned. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but there's a young woman at the door asking for you. She says she's from your former household, Sarah's cousin, I believe. She seems quite distressed." Arabella rose immediately. "Show her in, please." A few moments later, a young maid Arabella vaguely recognized was ushered into the morning room. The girl was red-eyed from crying, her hands twisting in her apron. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry to trouble you, but I didn't know where else to turn. It's about Lord Thornwood. He's done something terrible." Arabella's heart sank. "What's happened?" "He's gambling again, my lady. After you left last night, he went to one of those awful clubs. He lost a tremendous amount, more than he has, from what I overheard. And now there are men at Thornwood Hall demanding payment, threatening him. Your mother and sisters are terrified." All the peace Arabella had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by cold dread. After everything, after Adrian's clemency, after the tentative peace they'd achieved, her father had returned to his old ways. She found Adrian in his study and relayed the news. She watched his expression harden, saw the old anger flash in his eyes, and feared that all their progress would be undone. "How much does he owe?" Adrian asked, his voice tight. "I don't know." The maid didn't know the exact amount. Adrian stood, pacing to the window. For a long moment he said nothing, and Arabella held her breath, wondering what he would do. Finally he turned back to her. "I'm going to Thornwood Hall," he said, "to assess the situation and ensure your mother and sisters are safe." "But Arabella," he paused, his jaw working, "I won't pay his debts again. I can't. If I do, he'll never stop. He'll keep gambling, keep destroying himself and everyone around him." "I know," Arabella said quietly. "I don't expect you to. I just want to make sure my family is safe." "That I can do," Adrian promised. "Your mother and sisters can come here, if necessary. They'll always have a home with us. But your father—" He shook his head. "He has to face the consequences of his choices, Arabella. Not because I hate him, but because it's the only way he'll ever change." "I understand," Arabella said, though her heart ached. "Let me come with you." Together, they traveled to Thornwood Hall, arriving to find it in chaos. Rough-looking men were stationed outside, preventing anyone from leaving. Inside, Lord Thornwood sat in his study, his head in his hands, while Lady Thornwood and her daughters huddled together in the drawing-room. Adrian immediately took charge, confronting the creditors with the authority of his position. "How much is owed?" he demanded. The leader of the group, a burly man with scarred knuckles, named a sum that made Arabella gasp. It was enormous, enough to bankrupt the family entirely. "I won't pay it," Adrian said flatly. "But I will make you an offer. Lord Thornwood will sign over his estate to me, in trust for his wife and daughters. In exchange, I'll pay you half of what he owes and give you reasonable terms to recover the rest through other means." "That's not—" the man began. "That's my offer," Adrian interrupted, his voice cold and commanding. "Take it, or take your chances in court. I have the best solicitors in London, and I promise you, you'll get far less through legal proceedings." The creditors conferred among themselves, then grudgingly agreed. Within hours, papers had been drawn up, signed, and witnessed. Thornwood Hall now belonged to the Duke of Ashford, held in trust for Lady Thornwood and her daughters. Lord Thornwood retained a small allowance for his personal needs, but he would never again have access to substantial funds. When it was done, Adrian summoned Lord Thornwood to his study. Arabella stayed with her mother and sisters, comforting them, but she could hear the low murmur of voices through the door. "I've saved you one last time," she heard Adrian say. "But it's truly the last time, Lord Thornwood. I've done this not for you, but for your wife and daughters, who don't deserve to suffer for your weakness. But you need to understand, there will be no more rescues. The next time you gamble away money you don't have, you'll face the full consequences alone." Lord Thornwood's response was too quiet to hear, but his tone was defeated. When Adrian emerged, he looked exhausted. Arabella went to him immediately, and he pulled her close. "Your mother and sisters will stay here for a few weeks," he said quietly. "Your father—" "I've arranged for him to go to a private hospital that specializes in treating compulsive gamblers. He's agreed to go voluntarily. It's his last chance, Arabella. If he doesn't take it seriously, if he doesn't truly change, then he's beyond help." "Thank you," Arabella whispered. "Thank you for not turning your back on them. I know it must have been difficult after everything." "It was," Adrian admitted. "Part of me wanted to let him face ruin. But I kept thinking about what you said, that we're not responsible for our parents' choices, that we can choose our own path. I didn't want my path to be one of cruelty, even toward someone who hurt my family. I wanted it to be one of justice tempered with mercy." "You're a good man, Adrian Blackwell," Arabella said, looking up at him with love and pride. "Better than you give yourself credit for." "I'm trying to be the man you see when you look at me," Adrian said. "Some days are easier than others, but I'm trying." They stayed at Thornwood Hall for 2 more days, ensuring everything was properly arranged. Lady Thornwood was tearful but grateful, embarrassed by her husband's behavior but relieved that her daughters would be provided for. Margaret and Caroline were confused but resilient, already making plans for their extended visit to Ashford Park. When they finally returned home, with Lady Thornwood and the girls in tow, Arabella felt as though they'd weathered a storm together. It hadn't been pleasant, and it had brought back painful memories of Adrian's initial anger toward her father. But it had also proven that they were stronger together, that their marriage could survive difficulties without fracturing. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their shared chambers, Adrian had moved into Arabella's rooms weeks ago, making them truly theirs. Arabella turned to face her husband. "I was afraid today," she admitted. "Afraid that my father's relapse would undo all the progress we'd made. That you'd retreat back into anger and coldness." "I was afraid too," Adrian confessed. "When I first heard the news, my immediate reaction was rage. I thought, here is proof that people like Lord Thornwood never change, that my mercy was wasted. But then I looked at you, and I remembered what truly matters. Not revenge or vindication, but building a life with you. And I realized that your father's choices don't have to define either of us anymore." "When did you become so wise?" Arabella teased gently. "I'm not wise. I'm just learning, slowly, to listen to my heart instead of my anger. You're the one who taught me that." Arabella kissed him softly. "Then we've taught each other. You've taught me strength, shown me that I can face difficult situations without sacrificing my principles, that I don't have to accept less than I deserve just to keep the peace." They held each other in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes when two people are truly at ease with each other. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed midnight. "Adrian," Arabella said quietly. "Thank you. For everything. For being willing to change, for giving us a chance, for becoming the man I always hoped you could be." "Thank you for not giving up on me," Adrian replied. "For seeing past my worst behavior to something worth saving. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't insisted on building something better from the wreckage of our beginning." "We'd both be miserable," Arabella said practically. "Two people trapped in a cold marriage, making each other unhappy out of stubbornness and pride. I much prefer this version." "As do I," Adrian agreed. He kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips. "As do I." The next morning dawned bright and clear, and Arabella woke to find Adrian already awake, watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her heart ache. "Good morning," she murmured sleepily. "Good morning, my love." Adrian traced a finger along her cheek. "I have something I want to show you today, if you're willing." "What is it?" "A surprise. But you'll need to dress for outdoors. We'll be doing some riding." Intrigued, Arabella quickly prepared for the day. An hour later, they were on horseback, riding across Adrian's lands toward a section of the estate Arabella had never visited before. They rode for nearly an hour before Adrian finally stopped before a small rise. "There," he said, pointing to the vista beyond. Arabella gasped. Below them lay a valley she hadn't known existed, perfectly sheltered and lush with vegetation. A small stream ran through it, and the remains of an old cottage stood at one end, overgrown with ivy but still structurally sound. "It's beautiful," Arabella breathed. "I had no idea this was here." "It was my mother's favorite place," Adrian said. "She used to bring me here when I was small. We'd have picnics by the stream, and she'd tell me stories about all the adventures we'd have when I grew up." His voice grew quieter. "After she died, I couldn't bear to come here. It hurt too much. And after my father's decline, I avoided it entirely. But lately, I've been thinking about it again. About the happy memories, not just the loss." He turned to face Arabella. "I want to restore the cottage. Make it into a place for us, a retreat when we need to escape the demands of the estate. A place where we can bring our own children someday, if we're blessed with them, and create new happy memories." Arabella felt tears spring to her eyes. "Adrian, that's wonderful. Your mother would be happy to know you've reclaimed this place." "I think she would be happy to know I've reclaimed myself," Adrian said. "That I've found love again, that I'm learning to live in joy rather than anger." "You've given me that gift, Arabella." "We've given it to each other," Arabella corrected. "This is our triumph, not just mine or yours." They dismounted and walked down into the valley together, exploring the cottage and making plans for its restoration. Adrian pointed out features he remembered from childhood: the window where his mother had grown herbs, the fireplace where they'd warmed themselves on cool days, the oak tree where he'd built a treehouse with his father's help, before everything had gone wrong. As they stood together by the stream, watching the water flow over smooth stones, Arabella realized that this was the final healing, not just of their marriage, but of Adrian's wounded heart. He was ready to remember joy again, to create new happiness rather than dwelling in old pain. "I love you," she said simply, taking his hand. "I love you too," Adrian replied. "More than I ever thought possible. More than I knew I was capable of." "Do you remember what you said to me at the altar?" Arabella asked. "On our wedding day?" "I remember," Adrian said grimly. "Those words haunt me. I wish I could take them back." "I'm glad you can't," Arabella said, surprising him. "Because they were honest. They showed me exactly where we started, which makes where we are now all the more precious. We've traveled such a long distance, Adrian, from hatred to love, from revenge to forgiveness. If we'd started our marriage with affection, we might never have appreciated how extraordinary it is to find each other across such a divide." Adrian pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "You always know exactly what to say to make me feel better about my worst moments." "That's what wives are for," Arabella said, smiling against his chest. "That and occasionally reminding their husbands not to be idiots." "I can't promise never to be an idiot," Adrian warned. "I'm still capable of stubbornness and poor judgment." "I know. But now you're capable of apologizing and changing course when you're wrong. That's all anyone can ask." They stayed in the valley for hours, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. They would restore the cottage as a family retreat. They would travel together, seeing some of those far-off places Adrian had dreamed of as a boy. They would work together to improve the estate, implementing progressive policies that would benefit their tenants and the local community. And someday, perhaps, they would bring their own children here, continuing the cycle of love and healing. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they rode back to Ashford Park. Arabella's mother and sisters were settled in, already making themselves at home. Caroline ran to greet them as soon as they entered, chattering excitedly about the library and the gardens and all the wonderful things she'd discovered. Later, at dinner, surrounded by family and warmth and laughter, Arabella caught Adrian's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that genuine open smile she'd worked so hard to coax from him, and she smiled back, feeling a rush of love so intense it almost hurt. This was what they had built from ashes. This warmth, this joy, this sense of belonging and being truly known by another person. They had started with nothing but resentment and pain, and they had created something beautiful. That night, as they prepared for bed, Arabella looked at the 2 rings on her finger. The betrothal ring Adrian had given her as part of a business transaction, and the second ring he'd chosen out of love. Together, they told the story of their marriage, from cold beginning to warm present, from revenge to redemption. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "About how grateful I am," Arabella said. "For all of it, even the difficult parts. Because they led us here." "I'm grateful too," Adrian said. "For your patience, your strength, your refusal to accept anything less than what we both deserved. You saved me, Arabella. From myself, from my anger, from a life of lonely bitterness." "We saved each other," Arabella corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "And we'll keep saving each other, every day, for the rest of our lives. That's what marriage is, choosing each other again and again, through joy and difficulty alike." "Then I choose you," Adrian said. "Today and always. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because my life is infinitely better with you in it." "And I choose you," Arabella replied. "My husband, my partner, my love." They kissed then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. And as they moved toward the bed they now shared, Arabella thought about the journey they'd taken. From that terrible moment at the altar when Adrian had whispered his hatred, to this moment of perfect love and understanding. They had proven that even the worst beginning could lead to a beautiful ending, that revenge could be transformed into love, that two people from different worlds, bound together by anger and obligation, could choose to build something precious and true. Their story would never be a conventional romance. It would always be marked by the scars of their difficult beginning. But those scars had healed into something stronger than unblemished skin. They had become proof of survival, of growth, of the transformative power of love freely given. And as Arabella fell asleep in Adrian's arms, she thought that perhaps this was the greatest love of all. Not the easy kind that bloomed without effort, but the hard-won kind that was earned through honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to change. Their journey had begun with hatred whispered at an altar, but it had led them to love declared in the quiet darkness of their shared chambers, and that made all the difference.